Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Daily Easy English Talk. I'm Emma.
And I'm Jack. Thanks for joining us.
We've got quite a bit of material here covering some, well, pretty intense and fast-moving events coming out of Los Angeles recently. We're looking at federal immigration enforcement, significant protests breaking out, and then this really major federal response involving the military.
That's right. And our goal here, looking at these sources you've gathered, is really to try and unpack it all, cut through some of the noise, understand what seemed to, trigger these events,
Right.
how they escalated so quickly, and also, importantly, get a sense of the different perspectives. Who were the key players saying what?
And those players really emerge fast in these reports. You've got federal immigration authorities, ICE, obviously.
Yep.
Then local protesters right there on the scene, city and state leaders in California, Mayor Bass, Governor Newsom, and then, the Trump administration stepping in with the military decision. That's quite a mix.
It really is. And the sources, they really focus in on events happening right around now, June 10th, 2025, but showing how things built up really rapidly just over the last few days, starting late last week.
So where do the sources say the spark really was? What kicked this all off?
Well, they consistently point to tensions really ramping up in L.A. starting around Friday, June 6th, just last Friday.
Okay, and what specifically happened on that Friday?
So according to the reports, federal agents executed search warrants. 4 businesses were targeted.
Okay.
And the suspicion, unlawfully employing undocumented immigrants, and alongside that, falsifying records related to employment.
Gotcha. Do the sources mention where these businesses were?
They do. They name a couple specifically. One was a Home Depot in the Westlake area, and the other was a clothing manufacturer called Ambiance Apparel. That one's downtown.
And it seems like word got out incredibly fast. One source uses the phrase, word quickly spread about icy raids throughout Los Angeles, mainly through social media.
Yeah, exactly. You could just imagine how quickly that kind of news travels, especially in immigrant communities. The ripple effect must have been immediate.
Absolutely. And the reaction from city leadership was also immediate and strong based on these reports. They quote Mayor Karen Bass as being deeply angered, saying the tactics were designed to sow terror and disrupt community safety. She reportedly said the city would not stand for this. Very forceful language.
Very. And the sources also give us an early number, a tally of the impact right away. They mentioned immigrant arrests in the city topping 100 just following those initial sweeps.
Wow, over 100 right off the bat. That's significant.
It is. It sets the stage for what came next.
Okay, so you have the raids, the news spreading like wildfire online, the mayor strongly condemning it. What was the reaction like, on the ground at those locations?
Well, the sources describe people showing up very quickly, local activists, family members of workers, perhaps. They went right to the raid sites.
And started confronting the agents.
Yeah, confrontations were reported, and then there was a pretty high-profile incident that really escalated the visibility.
Ah, the arrest you mentioned earlier.
That's the one. David Huerta, he's the president of SEIU California, a very large and influential labor union.
Right.
He was arrested outside that Ambiance Apparel location on Friday.
What were the charges?
The report says conspiracy to impede an officer, apparently following some kind of altercation.
Okay. And the union's perspective?
SEI, according to the sources, viewed it as him simply exercising his constitutional right to peacefully protest. So you already see differing narratives emerging right there.
Definitely. And these protests didn't just stay at the businesses, did they? The sources say they spread.
They did. Spread pretty quickly to federal buildings downtown, places housing immigration courts, detention facilities. You started seeing signs reported like ICE out of L.A.
Right. And then things seem to have turned more volatile Friday evening.
That's where a significant shift happened, yeah. Amidst these ongoing protests, the LAPD declared an unlawful assembly.
Why? What prompted that?
The sources mention reports coming in that a small group of violent individuals are throwing large pieces of concrete. That seemed to be the trigger.
Okay.
And that's when officers in riot gear moved in to disperse the crowds.
And it sounds like things didn't really calm down over the weekend. The protests continued?
They did. Sources indicate they carried on right through the weekend and into the early part of this week. Not just downtown LA, but spreading a bit to nearby cities too, like Compton and Paramount were mentioned.
And alongside the protests, there were reports of violence and vandalism. This is where it gets complicated.
It does. The sources list quite a range of reported incidents, things like people hurling scooters and bottles at police cars,
Okay.
Waymo self-driving cars being set on fire, arrests for failure to disperse, looting, and then even more serious charges reported, like attempted murder connected to a Molotov cocktail and assault with a deadly weapon.
Yeah, that's a mix of things. How did Mayor Bass respond to that aspect, according to the reports?
She tried to draw a clear line, it seems. The sources quote her condemning the violence, definitely. But she also emphasized that, in her view, the majority of protesters were peaceful.
Right.
She suggested the violence was happening mostly late at night, maybe by fringe groups, she said. But crucially, she still linked the underlying cause of all the unrest back to the fear created by those initial ICE raids.
Okay. So condemning the violence but blaming the initial spark.
Exactly. It's a complex picture on the ground, for sure.
Yeah.
And all that unrest, that volatility, is what seems to have prompted the big response from Washington.
Right. This is where the federal government, the White House, really steps in. The sources say President Trump signed a memorandum pretty quickly authorizing National Guard troops.
Yes, thousands of them. And the justification given, according to the reports, was in response to what the White House termed violent mobs attacking ICE officers.
But a key point the sources stress is that this happened over the objections of the state and city leaders, right? This wasn't California asking for help.
Not at all. That's a crucial distinction the reports make. This was a federal decision imposed on the state, essentially.
And the scale was pretty significant, too. What were the numbers reported?
The sources mentioned roughly 4,000 National Guard members being deployed. And interestingly, about 700 active duty Marines as well.
Marines. Wow. And the cost? Any estimate on that?
There was. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth and a senior defense official gave lawmakers an estimate, cited in the sources. They said it could be at least $134 million US.
Just for this deployment?
Yeah, mostly for things like travel, housing, and food, the reports say. And they also mentioned the duration plan for at least the next 60 days.
60 days. Why so long, did they say?
Hegseth reportedly gave a reason. He said it was to show rioters, looters, and thugs that the federal presence wasn't just temporary, that they weren't leaving quickly. A strong message.
And President Trump defended this.
He did, according to the sources. He framed the situation in L.A. as out of control, saying the local police were unable to handle it. He also reportedly suggested the deployment was meant as a signal to other cities, basically. Interfere with ICE, and you'll face equal or greater force.
So this sets up a major conflict, not just on the streets, but between levels of government. State versus federal.
Absolutely. That's the next big chapter here. A real clash of authority playing out politically and very quickly in the courts.
Okay, so let's talk about that clash. The sources mention Governor Gavin Newsom filing an emergency request in federal court. This was Tuesday, Juneteenth. What was he trying to achieve?
His specific goal, based on the filing details in the reports, was to block the Trump administration. Specifically, blocking them from using those deployed National Guard troops and the Marines to actively assist with immigration raids.
So not just protecting buildings, but actually helping carry out the raids.
That was the concern, yeah. His filing apparently claimed there was a change in orders coming or potentially already happening.
Do they have evidence of that?
The filing included a declaration from a lawyer in the California Military Department, Paul Eck. He stated that the State Department had been informed that Pentagon was planning to direct the California National Guard, their own guard, now federalized, to carry out support roles. And that included, reportedly, things like securing perimeters where raids were happening, and even securing streets for immigration agents.
Wow. So basically using the guard to facilitate the raids.
That was the assertion. Though at the time of the filing, the sources say it was unclear if that specific mission change had actually started yet. But the concern was clearly there.
And Governor Newsom was pretty vocal about this publicly, too.
Oh, yeah. The reports quote a social media post where he said, "Trump is turning the U.S. military against American citizens," and called for the courts to immediately block these illegal actions. Strong words, very strong. And this whole situation is, well, highly unusual legally and historically. Sources point out, usually a governor requests federal troops if needed.
Right.
Deploying them against a governor's wishes is rare. Some reports drew comparisons, cautiously, to things like President Johnson sending troops to Alabama during the Civil Rights Movement in '65. Different context, obviously, but that same dynamic of federal power overriding state objections.
Mayor Bass seemed to see it this way, too, as an escalation by the federal government.
She did. Her perspective, reported in the sources, was that L.A. was essentially peaceful before the raids kicked things off. She felt the federal response, especially the military deployment, just made everything worse.
Did she comment on the Marines specifically?
Yeah, sources quote her questioning why Marines were even sent. She reportedly said, "I have no idea." And she voiced this suspicion that maybe the federal government was using LA as a kind of grand experiment, her words, to test how far they could go in taking over city or state functions.
Even the LAPD chief, Jim McDonnell, had concerns.
He did, according to the reports. While he expressed confidence in his own officers' ability to handle the situation locally, he pointed out that the Marines arriving without coordinating with LAPD first would create significant logistical and operational challenge. That lack of coordination seems to be a recurring theme in the reports.
Okay, so tensions high, lack of coordination. This all spilled into court very quickly.
Right. So California officially sued the Trump administration. Governor Newsom and the state attorney general Rob Bonta filed that lawsuit on Monday.
And what was the basis of the suit?
They described the federalization of the National Guard taking control of the state's guard as an illegal and unnecessary takeover.
And that emergency request on Tuesday, that was for a TRO, a temporary restraining order.
Exactly. They wanted the court to step in immediately. The goal of that TRO was specific: prevent the federalized guard and the active duty Marines from being used for law enforcement purposes on civilian streets.
But not necessarily stop them from protecting federal property.
Correct. The sources clarify that distinction. The request explicitly said it wasn't trying to stop them from, say, guarding federal buildings or protecting federal personnel. It was about preventing them from acting like local police,
Right.
or assisting directly in immigration enforcement actions among the civilian population.
How did the judge respond initially? This was Tuesday.
The judge, senior U.S. District Judge Charles R. Breyer, reportedly denied the request for an immediate order.
Okay.
But he didn't dismiss it outright. He scheduled a hearing for Thursday, so just a couple of days later, to hear the full arguments from both sides. So the legal fight was definitely just beginning.
And the Justice Department's position, they obviously opposed California's request.
Strongly. They called the state's request legally meritless, according to the source.
Meritless. Why?
Their argument was that granting the restraining order would actually jeopardize the safety of Department of Homeland Security personnel, meaning IC officers, and that it would improperly interfere with legitimate federal operations.
So a direct clash in legal interpretations there. Now, what about the actual role of the troops on the ground? It sounds like there was some confusion or conflicting information.
There definitely seems to have been. The initial reports and official statements, like the one from Marine Corps General Eric Smith cited in the sources, emphasize protection roles.
Right, protecting federal buildings, personnel, property.
Exactly. And General Smith specifically testified that while Marines are trained for crowd control, they crucially have no arrest authority when operating domestically like this.
So they can't act like police officers on U.S. streets.
Generally, no. And some sources suggested that maybe the bulk of the troops would actually remain sort of out of public view, maybe staged nearby, unless things got really violent and they were specifically called in.
But then there was that information in Newsom's court filing about potentially securing perimeters for raids.
Right. That suggested a potentially more active support role. And while some Guard members were seen visibly guarding federal buildings, the exact role, especially for the Marines or for the Guard near actual ICE operations, seemed, well, murky based on the reporting.
This brings up that law mentioned in the sources, the Posse Comitatus Act. Can you just briefly explain what that is and why it's relevant here?
Sure. Posse Comitatus is a really important old federal law. Basically, it prohibits using the U.S. Army and Air Force, and by extension, often applied to the Marines and Federalized National Guard too, to enforce domestic laws or act as police on U.S. soil.
Okay. Policing civilians is generally off limits for this military.
That's the principle.
Oh.
Now, there are exceptions. The big one is if the president invokes something called the Insurrection Act. That does allow the president to use military forces domestically to suppress civil disorder, insurrection, or rebellion. And the sources actually note a comment from President Trump on this, where he reportedly said, if there was an insurrection, I would certainly invoke it.
So holding that possibility out there.
Potentially. But invoking the Insurrection Act is a very big, controversial step.
Despite all the legal questions, though, there was footage emerging.
There was. Reports mention footage showing tactical military vehicles, like Humvees, actually driving on L.A. streets, particularly near that federal detention center downtown, and also seeing vans carrying detainees entering that facility.
And what about that ICE social media post? That sounded unusual.
It did. ICE reportedly posted images on X, their social media platform, showing National Guard troops standing nearby while ICE officers were detaining people. The description was that the guard appeared to be guarding the area around the operation.
Guarding the perimeter, essentially.
Kind of looked that way, and some former ICE officials quoted in the sources described this as potentially a first, seeing the military seemingly providing that kind of direct operational security for an ICE action, and it being publicized by ICE itself. Defense Secretary Hegseth even apparently celebrated this post on X.
So, visually at least, it suggested a closer integration than just protecting buildings far away.
It certainly raised questions and seemed to align with the concerns Governor Newsom was raising in court.
This whole situation obviously wasn't just contained to LA, was it? It had wider ripples?
Absolutely. The sources make it clear this resonated nationally. Solidarity protests popped up in cities all over the country.
Which ones were mentioned?
Let's see, San Francisco, New York, Atlanta, Philadelphia, Cleveland, Dallas, San Jose, Santa Ana, down in Orange County, San Diego.
Quite a few. And what were they protesting? The LA situation specifically?
Mostly, yeah. Protesting against ICE activity in general, deportations, but specifically condemning the federal response in LA and the idea of activating the military domestically like this.
The political reactions were flying fast and furious, too, from across the spectrum.
Oh, definitely. Really highlighted the deep divisions. On one end, you had House Speaker Mike Johnson reportedly suggesting Governor Newsom should be tarred and feathered. Pretty extreme language.
Wow. Okay, what about Democrats?
Senator Alex Padilla from California called the whole thing intentionally made by Donald Trump and said the federalization of the Guard was counterproductive.
But not all Democrats were saying the same thing.
No. Senator John Fetterman, for instance, reportedly criticized some fellow Democrats for, in his view, not condemning the violence during the protests strongly enough. A different emphasis there.
Interesting. What about other prominent figures?
Former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi called the administration's response really stupid, potentially illegal, and blamed Trump for inflaming things. But she also warned protesters about anarchists potentially exploiting the situation.
So, condemning the response, but also cautioning protesters.
Right. And Rep. Nanette Berrigan, another California Democrat, echoed Padilla, saying deploying the military was just inflaming the situation.
Was there any bipartisan concern specifically about the military aspect?
Yes, there was. The sources mention Independent Senator Angus King and Republican Senator Susan Collins, both expressing concerns specifically about deploying active duty Marines domestically. That seemed to cross a line for them. Other reactions.
Senator Chris Coons suggested Trump might be using the whole thing as a distraction. And Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, he called the protest violence outrageous, but then described Trump's military deployment as provocative, dangerous, and a threat to the bedrock of our democracy.
So condemning both certain protester actions and the federal response.
Exactly. And one more perspective from Congress mentioned was Rep. Lou Correa, another California Democrat. He called the initial ICE raids themselves counterproductive.
Okay.
And he basically urged the federal government to, quote, give us a little breathing room, back off, unless they were dealing only with serious, violent criminals. It shows that tension even within the Democratic delegation from California.
Beyond the politics and protests, what about the impact on the community, on just like daily life?
That comes through strongly in the reports about the LA schools. The superintendent, Alberto Carvalho.
Right, LAUSD.
Yeah. He described having to implement specific safety measures for over 100 school graduations happening now and for summer school programs starting up. What kind of measures?
Things like offering virtual attendance options and even making plans to allow families to shelter inside school venues if ICE raids were reported nearby during an event. That really speaks to the level of fear.
Wow, planning for raids during graduations? That's intense.
It really is. The sources quote Carvalho, talking powerfully about, daughters being the first in their families to graduate, but their parents might be too afraid to attend because of potential immigration enforcement. He even made a comment about feeling like they needed to rearrange the Statue of Liberty. He really emphasized schools needing to be safe havens, free from fear, upholding the right to education regardless of status. And he mentioned his own immigrant background, connecting it personally. It really grounds the whole thing in human terms.
Absolutely. Any other community responses mentioned?
Yeah. Faith leaders were reportedly planning a candlelight vigil downtown. The purpose cited was to call for an end to the violence of immigration raids, and also to criticize Trump's military deployment, framing it as something that incites violence rather than quells it.
Okay. And one last detail, a dispute over a phone call.
Yeah, it seems minor, But the sources mentioned a public back and forth between Trump and Newsom about whether a phone call between them actually happened or what was said.
Why is that significant?
It just kind of underscores the complete breakdown in communication and the high level of tension between the state and federal leadership as this whole crisis was unfolding. No trust there, clearly.
So wrapping this up, what's the big picture takeaway from digging into these sources? It feels incredibly complex, layers upon layers.
It really is. You have federal auctions triggering very local, visceral reactions. You have protests that are mostly peaceful but contain elements of violence. You have state leaders pushing back hard against federal authority. And then you have the military introduced into a domestic situation, which is always fraught. And everyone involved, the protesters, the mayor, the governor, the president, ICE, the military, they all see it through completely different lenses, according to these reports.
Right. It's like everyone has a different version of reality.
Exactly. And that's maybe the key insight from looking across all these sources together. They give you, the listener, a snapshot of just how deeply interconnected all these issues are. Immigration policy, civil liberties, protest rights, federal power, state autonomy. Trying to understand the sequence, what action led to what reaction, how fast it all happened, and crucially, the different justifications and perspectives offered by the key players. That's how you start to make sense of it, even amidst the noise.
It definitely helps cut through some of it. And maybe a final thought for you to consider based on all this. The sources themselves brought up historical parallels, moments where federal and state authority clashed, sometimes involving troops. It makes you wonder, what are the long-term consequences when these fundamental disagreements about law, order, and authority collide so directly, especially when the military gets drawn into domestic affairs? It leaves you with some heavy questions about the balance of power and what comes next.
So don't forget to subscribe to Daily Easy English Talk so you don't miss our next show.
Yeah, please do, and share it with your friends if you found it helpful.
Thanks for listening, everyone. Bye-bye.